Tonight's story is about a man named Herman Webster Mudgett. You may not recognize that name, but you almost certainly know him by another one. He is better known to history as H. Holmes, and he is widely regarded as one of the first documented serial killers in American history. His story takes place in the second half of the 19th century, at a time when the United States was expanding rapidly. Cities were growing faster than anyone could fully manage, and it was entirely possible for a person to move from one place to another and leave their entire past behind them. Holmes understood that better than almost anyone, and he used it to his advantage at every stage of his life. He was, by most accounts, a charming and capable man. He was educated, well-spoken, and able to present himself convincingly in almost any context, whether that was as a respectable businessman, a devoted husband, a trusted employer, or a qualified medical professional. People believed him because he gave them every reason to, and by the time they had reason to doubt him, it was often already too late. Over the course of roughly a decade, Holmes defrauded creditors, insurance companies, and business partners across multiple cities. He married 3 women simultaneously, maintaining separate households and separate identities for each of them. He built a large commercial building in Chicago that became the site of several murders, and he traveled across the northeastern United States and into Canada, leaving a trail of victims behind him that investigators would spend years trying to fully account for. He confessed to 27 murders, though the true number remains unknown. What is known is that he killed men, women, and children, that he did so with considerable planning and almost no visible remorse, and that he continued doing it for years before anyone managed to stop him. This is his story told from the beginning. Herman Webster Mudgett was born on May 16, 1861, in the small town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. The town itself was a quiet, rural place, the kind of community where everybody knew everybody, and where the families who lived there could trace their roots back generations to the very first English settlers who had carved out a life in that part of New England. Herman's parents, Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price, were both from those old settler families, deeply embedded in the history and culture of the region. Herman was the 3rd child in the family. Before him came his 2 older siblings, Ellen and Arthur, and after him came his younger brother, Henry. By all outward appearances, the Mudgett household looked like a fairly typical New England family of that era. His parents were both devout Methodists, regular churchgoers who took their faith seriously and raised their children within its framework. Religion was a central part of daily life in households like theirs, shaping not just Sunday mornings, but the entire moral and social structure of the home. However, behind that respectable church-going exterior, things were considerably darker. Herman's father, Levi, was not a stable or gentle man. He worked various jobs over the years, farming the land, trading goods, and at times painting houses, but he struggled to maintain any consistent sense of order or temperance in his personal life. He was, by multiple accounts, a heavy drinker, and his drinking had serious consequences for the people living under his roof. He was known to beat his children cruelly, and the atmosphere in the Mudgett home was one shaped as much by fear and unpredictability as it was by Methodist values and rural routine. Growing up in that environment, Herman found an unusual kind of refuge in his own mind. He was, from a very early age, an exceptionally intelligent child. His academic abilities stood out clearly among his peers, and he moved through his schooling with a level of capability that most of his classmates simply could not match. He attended Phillips Exeter Academy, one of the more prestigious preparatory schools in New England, before eventually graduating with honors from Gilmanton Academy at the age of just 16. For a boy from a rural farming town, that was a remarkable achievement, and it pointed toward a sharp and capable mind that was absorbing information and excelling in ways that went well beyond what was expected of him. But that same intelligence that made him stand out academically also made him a target. Children, then as now, did not always respond well to peers who were noticeably smarter or more capable than themselves, and Herman's classmates were no exception. He faced regular bullying, the kind that went beyond simple teasing and crossed into something more deliberately cruel. One incident in particular would turn out to have a profound and lasting effect on the direction of his life. A group of classmates, apparently intent on frightening him, took it upon themselves to force young Herman into a local doctor's office. Inside, they made him stand directly in front of a human skeleton, the kind that was commonly used for medical and educational purposes at the time, and they physically took the skeleton's hands and pressed them against his face. The intent was obvious: to horrify him, to reduce him to tears, to watch him panic and cower. And initially it worked. Herman was terrified. Standing there in that room, with the bones of a human being pressed against his skin, he felt genuine fear. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath of that moment. Rather than developing a lasting phobia, rather than carrying that terror with him and avoiding anything connected to death or human remains, Herman found that his fear began to dissolve and was replaced by something else entirely. He became curious. He started to think about what he had seen and felt, to turn it over in his mind, and the more he did, the more he found himself drawn toward it rather than repelled by it. He later claimed that the experience had actually helped him overcome his fears more broadly, that confronting that skeleton had somehow freed him from a whole range of anxieties he had previously carried. What followed was a deepening obsession with death itself. Herman began seeking out opportunities to understand it, to examine it, to get closer to it in a concrete and physical way. He started dissecting animals, studying their anatomy with a level of focus and interest that went well beyond ordinary childhood curiosity. For most children, dissecting a small creature might be a brief and unsettling experiment. For Herman, it became a sustained practice, a way of exploring the mechanics of living things and what happened to them when life left them. By the time he was ready for higher education, Herman had developed a clear interest in medicine, which made a certain kind of sense given everything that had been building in him since that encounter with the skeleton. In 1879, at the age of 18, he enrolled at the University of Vermont. He spent 1 year there before making a significant move, transferring in 1882 to the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, which was one of the more respected medical programs available to him at the time. His academic performance at Michigan was, interestingly, described as mediocre. This was a man who had graduated with honors from high school at 16 and had shown consistent intellectual ability throughout his early years, yet his performance at the university level was unremarkable by the standards of the institution. Whether this was due to a lack of engagement with the formal curriculum, or whether his attention and energy were being directed elsewhere, is difficult to say with certainty. What is known is that he managed to complete his studies and graduated in June of 1884. During his time at the University of Michigan, Herman worked in the anatomy laboratory under Professor William James Herdman, who was then serving as the chief anatomy instructor at the university. It was a position that gave him direct, hands-on access to human remains in a formal academic context, which aligned closely with the obsessions he had been developing since adolescence. But the relationship between Herman and Professor Herdman apparently extended beyond straightforward academic work. The two were said to have been involved in facilitating body snatching, the illegal practice of digging up recently buried corpses and supplying them to medical institutions as cadavers for dissection and study. Body snatching was not an entirely uncommon practice in 19th century America and Europe. Medical schools consistently needed a supply of human bodies for their anatomy courses, and the legal means of obtaining them were severely limited. Executed criminals were sometimes made available, but the demand far outstripped that supply, and so a black market for cadavers had developed, with individuals known as resurrection men making a business out of stealing bodies from graveyards. For a young man already deeply fascinated by death and human anatomy, and already working in the anatomy lab, becoming involved in that world was perhaps not entirely surprising. Before his time at Michigan, Herman had also spent time apprenticing under a man named Nahum White back in New Hampshire. White was a noted advocate of human dissection, someone who believed strongly in the importance of hands-on anatomical study, and who was willing to push against the social and legal boundaries that restricted access to human remains for educational purposes. That apprenticeship had given Herman early exposure to both the practice of dissection and the broader world of people who were willing to operate outside the law in the pursuit of anatomical knowledge. The body-snatching activities at Michigan were serious enough on their own, but they were not the only illegal activity Herman was engaged in during his college years. He had also, by his own later admission, developed a scheme involving cadavers and life insurance. The details of the scheme were straightforward in their basic structure. Herman would take a cadaver, use it to support a fraudulent life insurance claim, and collect money from the insurance company based on the false premise that a real, living person had died. He admitted to doing this not once but several times while he was still a student. It is worth pausing for a moment on that detail, because it reveals something important about who Herman Mudgett was becoming during those years. He was not simply a curious student with an unusual interest in death and anatomy. He was someone who had already, before finishing his formal education, begun deliberately and systematically defrauding people and institutions for financial gain. The obsession with death that had begun with a childhood encounter with a skeleton had evolved into something more calculated and more dangerous. He was learning how to use the world's discomfort with death as a tool, exploiting the administrative and emotional distance that people maintained from human remains in order to manipulate the systems around him. By the time he graduated from the University of Michigan in the summer of 1884, Herman Webster Mudgett had already lived a life shaped by fear, violence, obsession, and deception. He had grown up in a household where cruelty was routine, had discovered at a young age that death fascinated rather than frightened him, had honed his intelligence through years of exceptional academic work, and had already committed fraud multiple times before stepping out into the world as a qualified medical professional. He was 23 years old. The chapter of his life that would make him truly notorious had not yet begun, but everything that would drive it was already firmly in place. Herman Webster Mudgett arrived in Chicago in August of 1886. It was around this time that he stopped using his birth name entirely and began presenting himself to the world as H. Holmes. Chicago in the mid-1880s was a city in the middle of a period of extraordinary growth, loud and sprawling, and full of people arriving from all directions looking for opportunity. For a man like Holmes, it was exactly the kind of place where a person could reinvent themselves, where nobody knew your history and nobody was asking too many questions. He made his way to the Inglewood neighborhood, a busy commercial district on the south side of the city, and it was there that he came across a drugstore sitting on the northwest corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street. The store was owned by a woman named Elizabeth Holton, and she needed help running it. Holmes approached her, presented himself as a capable and hardworking man, and she gave him a job. He turned out to be a genuinely effective employee, at least on the surface, and over time he managed to work his way into a position where he was able to purchase the store from Holton entirely. It was a straightforward and seemingly legitimate transaction, and to anyone observing from the outside, it looked like a young, ambitious professional making his way in a new city. But Holmes was already thinking several steps ahead. Across the street from the drugstore there was an empty lot, and Holmes purchased it. In 1887, construction began on what would become a two-story mixed-use building, with retail spaces on the ground floor, including a new drugstore to replace the one he had bought from Holton, and apartments on the second floor. The building project, however, quickly revealed the pattern that would define almost everything Holmes did financially throughout his life. When the work was completed, or at least progressed far enough to serve his purposes, Holmes simply declined to pay the people who had built it. The architects who had drawn up the plans and the steel company, Eaton Iron and Steel, who had supplied the materials, both found themselves unpaid and with no sign that Holmes intended to settle his debts. They took him to court in 1888, and this would be far from the last time Holmes found himself facing legal action over money he owed and had no intention of repaying. Then in 1892, Holmes expanded the building further, adding a third floor on top of what already existed. To the various investors and suppliers he approached for this phase of construction, he explained that he intended to operate the third floor as a hotel during the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition, the enormous World's Fair that was set to draw millions of visitors to Chicago in 1893. It was a plausible and even shrewd-sounding business plan, and it gave Holmes the cover he needed to secure materials and financing from people who believed they were investing in a legitimate hospitality venture. The reality, as would eventually become clear, was considerably more complicated. In the years that followed Holmes's arrest and the subsequent investigation into his activities, the building became the subject of enormous public fascination and a great deal of sensationalized reporting. The yellow press of the era, always eager for a lurid story, dubbed the structure Holmes's murder castle, and the accounts that circulated in newspapers across the country described a building that was almost beyond imagination in its sinister design. According to these reports, the castle was a labyrinthine structure containing over 100 rooms laid out in a deliberately confusing maze, with doors that opened onto solid brick walls, staircases that led nowhere. Windowless rooms, secret torture chambers, trapdoors, gas chambers piped directly into guest rooms, and a crematorium in the basement where bodies could be disposed of without a trace. The stories painted a picture of a building that had been designed from the ground up as an instrument of mass murder, a place where Holmes could lure unsuspecting victims, trap them, kill them, and destroy all evidence of what he had done. It was a compelling and horrifying narrative, and it captured the public imagination in a way that has persisted for well over a century. The problem is that most of it was not true. Subsequent historical research, including a detailed examination of the building's actual construction records and physical layout, found that the third-floor hotel was, in reality, moderately sized and largely unremarkable. It was also unfinished, a direct consequence of Holmes's ongoing disputes with the builders he refused to pay. The building did contain some hidden rooms, but the evidence suggests these were used not for murder, but for a considerably more mundane purpose, hiding furniture and goods that Holmes had purchased on credit and had no intention of paying for. Given that defrauding creditors was one of Holmes's most consistent and well-documented activities throughout his life, this explanation is entirely consistent with everything else known about him. The gas chambers, the trapdoors, the torture devices, the basement crematorium, none of these were found to be real. The claim that Holmes had murdered tourists visiting the world's Columbian Exposition and sold their skeletons to nearby medical schools was similarly not supported by evidence. Holmes did have a documented history of supplying cadavers to medical institutions, but as established from his college years, his supply came from body snatching rather than from killing living people. There is no credible evidence that he ever murdered any of the exposition's visitors on the premises of the castle. Holmes also owned a separate one-story factory not far from the castle, which he claimed was intended for glass bending. Whether the factory was ever actually used for that purpose is unclear, but investigators later speculated that its furnace may have been used to destroy evidence connected to his crimes. After Holmes was arrested, the castle itself was gutted by a fire set by an unknown arsonist, which conveniently destroyed whatever physical evidence might have remained inside. The building was largely rebuilt in the aftermath and went on to serve as a post office for several decades, operating in that capacity until 1938. As for Holmes's actual methods of killing, he described them himself in his confession. He stated that his preferred approach was suffocation, achieved through various means, administering an overdose of chloroform, exposing victims to lighting gas fumes, or sealing them inside an airless vault until they suffocated. He also claimed to have used starvation in at least one case, and to have burned victims alive within the castle. Now, turning to the people who are believed to have been among his victims, it is worth beginning with the cases that are most thoroughly documented. The first of these involves a woman named Julia Smythe. Julia was Holmes's mistress, 31 years old at the time of her disappearance. She had originally come to the castle as the wife of a man named Dr. Lawrence Connor, who had moved into the building and taken a job working at the jewelry counter of Holmes's pharmacy. When Connor discovered that his wife was having an affair with Holmes, he quit his job and left the building, but he left without Julia and without their 5-year-old daughter, Pearl. Julia had gained custody of Pearl and chose to remain at the hotel, continuing her relationship with Holmes. Both Julia and Pearl disappeared on Christmas Eve of 1891. In the immediate aftermath of their disappearance, Holmes offered a series of explanations, none of which remained consistent. First, he said that Julia had left unexpectedly to visit a dying sister. Then he changed his story and said she had fled from her former husband. Eventually, he settled on a third account, that Julia had died during an abortion that he had performed or attempted to perform. Given that Holmes had a medical degree, the suggestion that he might have attempted an abortion was not entirely implausible on its face, but the mortality rate from such procedures was extremely high at that time, and Holmes was not known to have any particular experience or training in that area of medicine. As for Pearl, Holmes claimed to have poisoned the child, which he suggested was an attempt to prevent her from revealing what had happened to her mother. When investigators later excavated Holmes's cellar, they found a partial skeleton that appeared to belong to a child of approximately Pearl's age. Pearl's father, Dr. Connor, went on to serve as a key witness at Holmes's trial in Chicago. The second well-documented case involves a young woman named Emmeline Sigrand. Emmeline was 23 years old when she began working in Holmes's building in May of 1892, and she worked there for approximately 6 months before she disappeared in December of that same year. Holmes had reportedly sought her out specifically because of her connection to a doctor who was promoting a so-called vaccine that allegedly cured alcoholism, which was the kind of fraudulent medical scheme that Holmes found useful for his own purposes. In the weeks before her disappearance, people who knew Emmeline noticed that she seemed to have grown distant from Holmes and to have lost interest in their relationship. After she vanished, her parents were told that she had left to marry a man named Robert Phelps. Investigators later came to believe that Emmeline had become pregnant by Holmes, and that her death may have been the result of another failed abortion attempt that Holmes subsequently tried to cover up. Her empty luggage trunk was sent back to her mother in Anderson, Indiana, an odd and telling detail that suggested someone had wanted to create the impression that Emmeline had simply moved on. Her skeleton was eventually found at the home of a Chicago physician, identified with the help of a man named M.G. Chappell, who admitted under questioning that he had articulated 3 separate skeletons for H.H. Holmes. The third major case involves 2 sisters, Minnie and Nanny Williams. Minnie, whose full name was Wilhelmina Williams, was 24 years old and a one-time actress when she moved to Chicago in early 1893. Holmes claimed to have met her through an employment office, though investigators believed he had actually encountered her years earlier in Boston, at a time when he had been operating under the alias Harry Gordon. He offered her a job at the hotel as his personal stenographer, and she accepted. Once Minnie was working for him and living under his influence, Holmes set about persuading her to transfer the deed to a piece of property she owned in Fort Worth, Texas, over to a man named Alexander Bond, which was, of course, another alias Holmes was using at the time. In April of 1893, Minnie signed the deed over, with Holmes himself serving as the notary on the transaction. He subsequently transferred the deed again, this time signing it over to his associate Benjamin Pitezel, giving Pitezel the alias Benton T. Lyman for the purpose. The following month, Holmes and Minnie began presenting themselves as husband and wife and rented an apartment together in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. Minnie's younger sister, 18-year-old Anna Williams, known to her family as Nanny, came to visit them there. On July 5, 1893, Nanny wrote a letter to her aunt. In it, she described her plans to accompany Holmes, whom she referred to as Brother Harry, on a trip to Europe. She closed the letter with a message that, read in hindsight, carries a particular weight. Brother Harry says you need never trouble any more about me, financially or otherwise. He and sister will see to me. I hope our hard days are over. Neither Minnie nor Nanny was ever seen alive again after that point. Holmes continued to use Minnie's name in future fraudulent schemes, which was consistent with his broader pattern of treating the people around him as instruments to be used and then discarded. Beyond these 3 central cases, there were numerous other individuals who were suspected of having been killed by Holmes, though the evidence in many of these cases was less conclusive. A 68-year-old creditor named John de Bruhl died on April 17, 1891, in the Castle drugstore. A witness reported that de Bruhl had collapsed and died shortly after Holmes poured a black liquid down his throat. At the time, foul play was not suspected, and his death was recorded without further investigation. It was not until 1895 that it was discovered Holmes had insured de Bruhl's life and had profited financially from his death. A young woman named Emily Van Tassel disappeared in 1891 after working at Holmes's drugstore. Holmes mentioned her in his confession, and her mother believed she had been one of his victims. Her name appeared on a list of suspected victims compiled in 1897. A man referred to only as Dr. Rustler had an office in the castle and went missing in 1892. Holmes mentioned killing Rustler in his confession, though the details surrounding this case remained limited. A stenographer named Kitty Kelly also went missing in 1892, though little additional information about her case was ever established. John Davis, a man from Greenville, Pennsylvania, traveled to Chicago to visit the 1893 World's Fair and simply vanished. He was not declared legally dead until 1920, nearly 3 decades after his disappearance. Harry Walker from Greensburg, Indiana, went missing in November of 1893. He had allegedly taken out a life insurance policy, naming Holmes as the beneficiary for the sum of $20,000, and he had written to friends telling them he was working for Holmes in Chicago. In June of 1894, Holmes and his associate Benjamin Pitezel took a man named George Thomas to a swamp along the Tombigbee River in Mississippi, killed him there, and disposed of the body. Holmes later confessed this murder to his second wife. A man named Milford Cole from Baltimore disappeared in July of 1894 after receiving a telegram from Holmes asking him to come to Chicago. In 1895, investigators searching the castle found a bank book belonging to a woman named Lucy Burbank, along with a quantity of human hair inside a chimney flue. What had happened to Lucy Burbank was never definitively established. There were also 2 people in Lake County, Illinois, believed to have been killed by Holmes sometime in the 1890s. Their deaths were not confirmed until 1919, 23 years after Holmes had already been executed, when the remains of an unidentified man and woman were found on a farm in the area. When Holmes eventually confessed, he claimed responsibility for 27 killings in total. Of those 27, only 8 were confirmed as actual murders, with 1 additional case considered probable. Several of his claimed victims turned out to be very much alive, which raised serious questions about the reliability of his confession more broadly. Dr. Robert Leacock, whom Holmes claimed to have murdered in 1886 for insurance money, actually died of natural causes in Watford, Ontario, in October of 1889. A man named Rogers from Morgantown, West Virginia, whom Holmes claimed to have killed in 1888, was later found to be alive. Kate Durkee of Omaha, whom Holmes claimed to have killed in 1892, also turned up alive. And a man named L. Warner, the owner of a glass factory that Holmes had purchased, whom Holmes claimed to have burned alive in the basement kiln, was likewise found to be living. The murders that were confirmed included Julia Connor and her unborn child and Pearl Connor, killed at Christmas of 1891, Emmeline Sigrand, killed in 1892, Emily Van Tassel, killed in 1892, Minnie and Nanny Williams, killed in 1893, and Milford Cole, killed in 1894. One additional death, that of a woman named Virginia Anna Betts, who died suddenly at her home 1 block from the castle on February 8, 1892, was considered probable. Holmes claimed to have poisoned her, stating that his motivation was either to cancel a debt she held or simply to watch her die. A number of other claimed killings remained unconfirmed, including the deaths of a domestic worker named Lizzie, a banker from northern Wisconsin referred to only as Rogers, a woman named Sarah Cook and her niece, a janitor named Robert Latimer, an unnamed wealthy female tenant, an unnamed male tenant killed during the exposition, and Minnie Williams's brother, Baldwin Hanscom Williams. What the full and accurate accounting of Holmes's victims actually looks like may never be entirely known. The combination of his own unreliable confessions, the destruction of physical evidence in the castle fire, and the passage of time has left many of the cases permanently unresolved. What is certain is that H. Holmes was a man who moved through the world treating other people as resources to be exploited, defrauded, and in a confirmed number of cases, killed, and that he did so with a degree of calculation and patience that set him apart from almost any criminal of his era. Holmes did not work alone. For much of his criminal career in Chicago, he had beside him a man named Benjamin Freeland Pitezel, and the story of how the 2 of them met is, in its own way, entirely typical of how Holmes operated. Both men happened to be working out of the Chemical Bank building on Dearborn Street at the same time. Pitezel was there to exhibit an invention of his, a coal bin he had designed and was hoping to sell. Holmes was there for his own reasons, and when he encountered Pitezel, he recognized something useful in the man almost immediately. Pitezel was 38 years old, a carpenter by trade, and he came with a criminal past that made him, in Holmes's estimation, exactly the kind of person who could be relied upon for work that needed to stay hidden. The two men became close, and over time Holmes drew Pitezel deeper and deeper into his schemes, using him as a right-hand man, an accomplice, and a general instrument of whatever plan Holmes happened to be running at any given moment. A district attorney who later became involved in the case described Pitezel in terms that were as blunt as they were accurate. He called him Holmes's tool, his creature. It was a description that captured something essential about the dynamic between the two men. Pitezel was not an equal partner in any meaningful sense. He was a man who had been drawn into Holmes's orbit and had gradually become dependent on it, used for whatever purpose Holmes required. By the middle of 1894, Holmes's situation in Chicago had become untenable. Insurance companies were pressing to have him prosecuted for arson, and the legal pressure was building to a point where remaining in the city was no longer a viable option. In July of 1894, Holmes left Chicago. He made his way to Fort Worth, Texas, where he had come into possession of property that had belonged to the Williams sisters, the two women who had disappeared after falling under his influence the previous year. True to form, Holmes immediately attempted to build something on the Fort Worth property, and equally true to form, he once again arranged for construction work to be carried out without any intention of paying the people who were doing it. The same pattern that had defined his building projects in Chicago repeated itself in Texas. Contractors and suppliers providing labor and materials on the assumption they would be compensated, and Holmes walking away from the debts without a second thought. But Fort Worth was only a temporary stop. Holmes's movements during this period were rapid and restless, and it was not long before he found himself in St. Louis, Missouri. It was there in July of 1894 that he was arrested for the first time. The charge was selling mortgaged goods, a relatively contained financial crime compared to what he had been engaged in over the previous several years, but an arrest nonetheless. He was bilaid out promptly and did not spend a significant amount of time behind bars on that occasion. But the brief period he did spend in jail turned out to be consequential in a way that Holmes almost certainly had not anticipated when he first arrived there. While in jail, Holmes found himself in conversation with another prisoner, a convicted outlaw named Marion Hedgebeth. Hedgebeth was serving a 25-year sentence and was not going anywhere, but he was the kind of man who knew people, and Holmes, characteristically, recognized that and found a way to make use of it. Holmes had been developing a plan to defraud an insurance company out of $10,000. The scheme was straightforward in concept: take out a life insurance policy on himself, then fake his own death and collect the payout. To make it work cleanly, he needed a lawyer he could trust, someone who would participate in the fraud without going to the authorities. He offered Hedgebeth a $500 commission in exchange for a name. Hedgebeth gave him one. The man Holmes was directed to was a young St. Louis attorney named Jephthah Howe. Holmes approached Howe, laid out the scheme, and Howe, rather than declining, thought the plan was brilliant and agreed to become part of it. The attempt, however, did not succeed. The insurance company grew suspicious and refused to pay out the claim, and Holmes, recognizing that pressing the matter would only draw more attention to himself, let it drop. But the idea itself was sound, in his view, and he began to think about how to execute a version of it that would actually work. The answer, he decided, was Benjamin Pitezel. Holmes went at Pitezel with a proposal. Pitezel would fake his own death. His wife Carrie would then file a claim on a $10,000 life insurance policy that Pitezel held, collect the money, and the payout would be split 3 ways between Pitezel, Holmes, and Howe. The plan was to be carried out in Philadelphia. Pitezel would travel there and establish himself under a false identity, presenting himself to the world as an inventor named B.F. Perry. He would then stage his death, making it appear that he had been killed in a laboratory explosion, and Holmes would supply an appropriate cadaver to serve as the body that the insurance company and the authorities would examine. Pitezel agreed to this arrangement. What Pitezel did not know, and what he had no reason to suspect, was that Holmes had no intention of sourcing a cadaver. On September 4, 1894, Holmes killed Benjamin Pitezel. He administered chloroform to render him unconscious, and then he set Pitezel's body on fire using benzene. In the confession Holmes later gave, he implied that Pitezel had still been alive at the point when he set him on fire, that the chloroform had merely incapacitated him rather than killed him. But the forensic evidence that was presented at Holmes's trial told a different story. The physical examination of Pitezel's remains indicated that the chloroform had actually been administered after Pitezel was already dead, not before. The most likely explanation for this sequence of events is that Holmes had killed Pitezel by some other means first, and had then applied the chloroform to the body afterward in order to create the appearance of a staged suicide, giving himself a layer of protection should he ever be charged with murder. Whatever the precise sequence of events, the outcome was the same. Pitezel was dead, his body was used to support the fraudulent insurance claim, and Holmes collected the $10,000 payout. What happened next revealed just how far Holmes was willing to go, and how completely indifferent he was to the suffering of the people around him. Pitezel had a wife, Carrie, and the couple had 5 children together. Holmes went to Carrie and, through a combination of manipulation and deception, persuaded her to allow 3 of her children to be placed in his care. He told her nothing of what had actually happened to her husband. Instead, he maintained the fiction that Pitezel was alive, hiding in London, and that the whole situation was part of a plan that would eventually be resolved. Carrie, trusting and entirely unaware of the truth, accepted this explanation and handed over 3 of her children, 13-year-old Alice, 9-year-old Nellie, and 7-year-old Howard. What followed was one of the more chilling episodes in the entire Holmes story. Holmes traveled through the northeastern United States and into Canada with the 3 Pitezel children, moving from city to city, staying in rented houses along the way. At the same time, he was escorting Carrie Pitezel along a completely parallel route, keeping mother and children separated, lying to Carrie at every stage about where her children were and what condition they were in. He was also simultaneously traveling with his current wife at yet another separate location, a woman who had no knowledge of any of what was happening around her. At one point in Detroit, as Holmes prepared to cross into Canada, the various parties he was managing were separated from one another by only a few city blocks, each entirely unaware of how close the others were. The logistics of maintaining that many simultaneous deceptions, across multiple cities and across an international border, was extraordinary, and it speaks to the degree of control and calculation that Holmes was capable of sustaining even under conditions of considerable pressure. Howard Pitezel was the first of the 3 children to die. Holmes killed him on October 10, 1894, in Indianapolis, Indiana, where he had rented a house in the Irvington neighborhood. In the days leading up to Howard's death, Holmes was seen visiting a local pharmacy, where he purchased the drugs he would use to kill the boy. He was also seen at a repair shop where he had knives sharpened. After Howard was dead, Holmes used those knives to dismember the body before burning it. When investigators later searched the Indianapolis house, they found Howard's teeth and fragments of his bones inside the chimney. Alice and Nellie were killed 15 days later, on October 25, 1894, in Toronto. Holmes forced both girls into a large trunk and locked them inside. He then drilled a hole in the lid of the trunk, fed one end of a rubber hose through the hole, and connected the other end to a gas line. Both girls were asphyxiated inside the trunk. Holmes buried their nude bodies in the cellar of the house he had been renting at 16 St. Vincent Street in Toronto, digging a grave approximately 3 feet deep. The investigation that eventually uncovered what had happened to the Pitezel children was led by a Philadelphia Police Department detective named Frank Jayer. Jayer had been assigned to the Holmes case and given the specific task of finding the 3 missing children. He began his work in June of 1894, methodically retracing Holmes's movements city by city, following the trail of aliases, rented houses, and brief stays that Holmes had left behind him as he moved across the country. It was painstaking work and it took time, but Jayer was thorough and persistent. When he reached Toronto and located the house on St. Vincent Street, he began digging in the cellar. He later wrote about what he found there, describing how the odor grew more and more horrible the deeper they dug, and how, at a depth of 3 feet, they first encountered what appeared to be the bone of a forearm. The decomposed bodies of Alice and Nellie Pitezel were recovered from that cellar. While he was in Toronto, Jair made another discovery that proved to be equally significant. Holmes had kept a collection of letters written by the Pitezel children during the period when he had them in his custody, letters that had never been sent to their family. The existence of these unsent letters provided investigators with a detailed record of the children's movements and gave Jair the information he needed to continue following Holmes's trail. The letters led to a more thorough investigation of Holmes's Chicago property and ultimately directed Jair to Indianapolis, where the remains of Howard Pitezel were recovered from the chimney of the Irvington house. By the time Frank Jair had completed his work, the full scale of what Holmes had done to the Pitezel family had become clear. He had killed the father, deceived the mother, separated her from her children, and then murdered all 3 of the children who had been placed in his care, doing so across multiple cities, in multiple states and countries, over the course of several weeks. The calculated patience of it, the ability to maintain the deception while simultaneously planning and carrying out the killings, was something that investigators and journalists of the era struggled to fully comprehend. It was not the act of someone who had lost control or acted in a moment of rage. It was the act of someone who had decided what he was going to do and then simply done it, one step at a time, while simultaneously managing the people around him with a degree of skill that made the whole thing, in its own terrible way, almost impossible to believe. The end, when it finally came, arrived in Boston. On November 17, 1894, Holmes was arrested there after being tracked from Philadelphia by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, one of the most well-known and effective private investigative organizations in the country at the time. The charge that was used to hold him was, in the context of everything he had done, almost absurdly minor, an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas. But the authorities were not particularly concerned with the horse theft. What they were concerned about was the growing body of evidence connecting Holmes to serious crimes and the very clear signs that he was preparing to leave the country. He had his 3rd wife, Georgiana Yoke, with him, a woman who remained entirely unaware of what her husband had been doing in the months and years before their marriage, and investigators believed that if they did not act quickly, Holmes would be gone before they had the opportunity to build a proper case against him. The horse theft warrant gave them the legal mechanism they needed to take him off the street and keep him there while the larger investigation continued. It was a practical solution to a complicated problem, and it worked. Holmes was in custody, and this time he would not be walking out. The investigation that followed his arrest was extensive and reached into multiple cities. In July of 1895, following the discovery of Alice and Nellie Pitezel's bodies in the cellar of the Toronto house, Chicago police and journalists turned their attention to Holmes's building in Inglewood, the structure that had by then acquired the nickname the Castle among the local community. The investigation of the castle generated an enormous amount of public interest and an equally enormous amount of speculation, much of it sensational and not particularly grounded in what the investigators actually found. What they did find in terms of physical evidence was limited. There was a piece of human bone that may have belonged to Julia Connor. There were the remains of a child that may have been Pearl Connor. There was a burned gold watch chain and a set of burned dress buttons that appeared to have belonged to Minnie Williams. And there was a tuft of human female hair found inside a chimney flue. It was circumstantial, suggestive, deeply unsettling in what it implied, but it was not sufficient to support a murder conviction in a Chicago court. The evidence simply did not meet the standard required, and prosecutors recognized that attempting to try Holmes in Chicago on the basis of what had been recovered from the castle would be a significant risk. The stronger case, the one with the clearest and most direct evidence of murder, was in Philadelphia. Benjamin Pitezel's death was documented, the insurance fraud was documented, and the forensic evidence from the examination of Pitezel's remains told a coherent and damning story. That was where Holmes would be tried. In October of 1895, Holmes stood trial in Philadelphia for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. The proceedings did not last long. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. By the time the verdict was delivered, it had also become evident to everyone involved in the case that Holmes had murdered the three Pitezel children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, in addition to their father. The full scope of what he had done to that family was now a matter of public record. Following his conviction, Holmes confessed. The confession covered 27 murders committed across Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto, as well as 6 attempted murders. It was a document that generated immediate and widespread attention, not least because Holmes had sold it. The Hearst newspaper organization paid him $7,500 for the rights to his confession, which was then published and read by an enormous audience across the country. Holmes, characteristically, had found a way to profit even from his own downfall. While he was writing the confession in his prison cell, Holmes made an observation that struck those around him as unusual. He noted that his appearance had changed significantly since his imprisonment, that the face looking back at him from the mirror was noticeably different from the one he had presented to the world during the years of his crimes. Whether this was a genuine physical phenomenon or simply Holmes constructing another layer of narrative around himself is impossible to say with certainty. On May 7, 1896, Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. He was 34 years old. Those who witnessed the execution remarked on his composure in the final moments. Until the very end, Holmes remained calm and amiable, showing almost none of the fear, anxiety, or distress that most people facing execution display. He had lived his entire adult life performing a version of himself for the people around him, and it appears he maintained that performance right up to the last moment. There was, however, one request he made in the days before his execution that stood out from the otherwise composed demeanor he was projecting. Holmes asked that his coffin be encased in concrete and buried 10 feet below the ground. His stated reason was that he was afraid body snatchers would steal his corpse and use it for dissection. The irony of that request was not lost on those who knew his history. Here was a man who had spent years stealing bodies from graveyards and selling them to medical schools, who had used cadavers to commit insurance fraud, who had articulated the skeletons of people he had killed and sold them to physicians, now expressing genuine anxiety about the possibility that the same fate might befall him. The request was granted. His coffin was placed in concrete before burial, and he was interred in an unmarked grave at Holy Cross Cemetery, a Catholic cemetery in Edon, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia. The hanging itself did not go cleanly. Holmes's neck did not break in the way that a properly conducted execution was intended to produce. Instead of the swift death that a broken neck would have brought, Holmes strangled slowly, his body twitching for more than 15 minutes before he was finally pronounced dead. After Holmes was gone, the story continued to generate consequences for the people who had been connected to him. Marion Hedgepeth, the outlaw Holmes had met in the St. Louis jail in 1894, the man who had given him the name of Jephthah Howe in exchange for a promised $500 commission that Holmes never paid, had eventually informed on Holmes to the authorities and been pardoned for doing so. Hedgepeth lived for another 13 years after Holmes's execution, but his end was not a peaceful one. On New Year's Eve of 1909, he was shot and killed by a police officer named Edward Jaburek during a holdup at a bar in Chicago. Another figure connected to the castle also came to a notable end in the years that followed. Patrick Quinlan had been the caretaker of Holmes's building in Inglewood, a man who had been present during the years when the castle was at the center of Holmes's activities, and who therefore knew or had seen things that were never fully disclosed to investigators. On March 7, 1914, the Chicago Tribune reported on Quinlan's death, noting that with him gone, the mysteries of Holmes's castle would likely remain unexplained forever. Quinlan had died by suicide, having taken strychnine. His body was found in his bedroom, and beside it was a note. The note contained only 4 words, "I couldn't sleep." His surviving relatives said that in the months before his death, Quinlan had been suffering from hallucinations and had described himself as haunted. What exactly it was that kept Patrick Quinlan awake at night, what he had seen or done or been aware of during his years at the castle, was never established. The building itself had already been damaged by arson before Quinlan's death. In August of 1895, two men were observed entering the back of the castle at around 9 o'clock in the evening. Approximately half an hour later, the same two men were seen leaving the building and running away rapidly. Shortly afterward, there were several explosions from inside the structure, and the building went up in flames. When investigators examined the scene after the fire, they found a half-empty gas can underneath the back steps. The castle survived the fire, however, and continued to be used for various purposes after it was rebuilt and repaired. It remained standing until 1938, when it was finally torn down. The site where Holmes's building once stood is now occupied by the Inglewood branch of the United States Postal Service. The story did not end entirely with Holmes's burial either. In 2017, more than a century after his execution, questions began circulating about whether Holmes had actually been the person who was hanged at Moyamensing Prison in 1896, with some suggesting he had somehow escaped execution and lived out the remainder of his life under another identity. To resolve the matter, Holmes's body was exhumed for forensic testing. The examination was led by Janet Monge of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. When the coffin was opened, the concrete casing Holmes had requested had done exactly what he had hoped it would do in terms of preservation, though not in the way he had intended. Because the concrete had sealed the coffin so effectively, the body inside had not decomposed in the normal way. Holmes's clothing was found to be almost perfectly preserved after more than 120 years in the ground. His mustache was still intact. The body was examined thoroughly, and identification was made through his teeth, which provided a conclusive match. The remains in the concrete-encased coffin were confirmed to be those of H. H. Holmes. He was reburied after the examination was complete, returned to the unmarked grave where he had lain for over a century, encased once again in the concrete he had asked for, 10 feet below the ground. There is a side to Holmes's story that ran quietly alongside everything else, largely hidden from view, and it is worth returning to now that the full arc of his crimes has been told. While Holmes was building his castle, defrauding his creditors, manipulating his victims, and eventually murdering the people closest to him, he was also maintaining a domestic life that most of the people in it knew nothing about in its entirety. He was a husband multiple times over and a father, and he managed those relationships with the same compartmentalization that defined every other aspect of how he moved through the world. The first of his 3 marriages took place long before anyone outside of a small circle of people in New Hampshire had any reason to know his name. On July 4, 1878, Holmes married a young woman named Clara Lovering in Alton, New Hampshire. He was 17 years old. Clara was, by all accounts, an ordinary young woman from the same part of New England where Holmes had grown up, and there is no reason to believe she had any sense of what kind of person she was binding herself to when she married him. The couple had 1 child together, a son born on February 3, 1880, in the town of Loudon. They named him Robert Lovering Mudgett, giving him his mother's maiden name as his middle name, and keeping the family surname that Holmes himself would later abandon entirely. Robert went on to live a life that could not have been more different from his father's. He became a certified public accountant, a profession built on precision, honesty, and the accurate management of other people's money, and he eventually served as the city manager of Orlando, Florida. He died on November 3, 1956, at the age of 76, having outlived his father by 60 years, and having spent those decades building a respectable and entirely unremarkable life. The marriage that produced him, however, was not a happy or safe one. Housemates who lived in proximity to Holmes and Clara during those early years later recalled that Holmes was physically violent with his wife. The abuse was not a single incident but an ongoing pattern, and by 1884, before Holmes had even finished his medical degree at the University of Michigan, Clara had made the decision to leave. She moved back to New Hampshire, and from that point on had very little contact with her husband. Holmes, as was his habit with anyone who ceased to be useful to him, moved on without apparent difficulty. After leaving Michigan in 1884, Holmes drifted through several locations before eventually arriving in Chicago, and each stop along the way left behind at least one unsettling detail. In Moores, a small town in upstate New York, a rumor began circulating among the community that Holmes had been seen in the company of a young boy, and that the boy had subsequently disappeared. Holmes, when the subject came up, said the boy had simply returned to his home in Massachusetts. Nobody investigated the matter, and Holmes left town shortly afterward. He made his way to Philadelphia, where he was hired as a keeper at Norristown State Hospital. He quit after only a few days, leaving before any record was made of why he had decided to go. He then found work at a drugstore in the city, which was more familiar territory for him. But that position also ended abruptly when a boy died after taking medicine that had been purchased at the store. Holmes denied any involvement and left Philadelphia immediately. It was at this point, before making his way to Chicago, that he changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes, and later settled on the shortened version, H. Holmes, that he would carry for the rest of his life. The purpose was simple and practical. He had left behind him a trail of people he had wronged, and a new name provided a degree of protection against anyone who might be looking for the person responsible. When Holmes arrived in Chicago in 1886, the question of his marriage to Clara was still legally unresolved. They were still husband and wife. Clara was in New Hampshire, cut off from any real knowledge of what her husband was doing, and Holmes showed no urgency about formally ending the marriage. Then in late 1886, while still legally married to Clara, Holmes married again. The woman was Meada Belknap, 24 years old, and the ceremony took place in Minneapolis, Minnesota. A few weeks after the Minneapolis wedding, Holmes filed for divorce from Clara, citing infidelity on her part as the grounds. The claim was not supported by evidence of any kind, and the legal proceedings stalled almost immediately. Paperwork from the period indicated that Clara was probably never even told the suit had been filed. The case sat unresolved for years and was eventually dismissed on June 4, 1891, on the grounds of want of prosecution. Holmes had simply never followed through on it. The divorce was never finalized, which meant that his marriage to Meada was bigamous and would remain so for the entirety of its existence. Holmes and Meada had one daughter together, born on July 4, 1889, in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago, the same neighborhood where Holmes was building his castle and running his various schemes. They named her Lucy Theodate Holmes, and she would go on to become a public school teacher, living until December 29, 1956. Holmes maintained a household with Meada and Lucy in Wilmette, Illinois, a quiet suburban community to the north of Chicago, and traveled into the city regularly for business. To anyone observing that domestic arrangement from the outside, he would have appeared to be a perfectly ordinary suburban husband and father. It was a useful appearance to maintain, and Holmes was skilled at maintaining it. While he was keeping that household in Wilmette, he was simultaneously managing the castle in Englewood, defrauding creditors and insurance companies, and conducting a relationship with his mistress, Minnie Williams. In May of 1893, Holmes began presenting Minnie as his wife in various social and business contexts, using her identity in ways that served his purposes. Minnie, as has already been described, disappeared later that same year along with her younger sister Nanny, and Holmes continued to use Minnie's name in subsequent fraudulent schemes long after she was gone. And then on January 17, 1894, Holmes married for a third time. The ceremony took place in Denver, Colorado, and the woman was named Georgiana Yoke. At the moment he stood in Denver and exchanged vows with Georgiana, Holmes was still legally married to Clara Lovering, whose divorce had been dismissed 3 years earlier without ever being finalized. He was also still married to Meada Belknap, with whom he had a daughter living in Wilmette. Georgiana Yoke, like Meada before her, appears to have known nothing of the other marriages. She was one more person who had been drawn into proximity with Holmes without any real understanding of who he was. It is worth pausing on that for a moment, because it captures something essential about how Holmes operated throughout his entire adult life. He was not simply a man who committed crimes. He was a man who constructed false versions of himself for every person in his life, maintaining those constructions simultaneously across across multiple cities and relationships for years at a time. Clara in New Hampshire knew one version of him. Mayetta and Wilmette knew another. Georgiana in Denver knew yet another. His victims knew whatever version of himself he had decided would be most effective in getting them to trust him. And underneath all of those constructed identities was the person he actually was, which was someone that none of the people around him, it seems, ever fully saw until it was too late.